In the late 1990s, track workers on the London Underground were being faced with outsourcing to private contractors. As part of the wider campaign against it, workers at one depot organised themselves into the Workmates collective. An experiment in rank-and-file control, Workmates organised mass meetings to overcome divisions and took on-the-job direct action to break the UK's strict anti-strike laws. This is working class history.
Alla mattina appena alzata, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao alla mattina.
Before we get started, just a reminder that our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Our supporters fund our work and in return get exclusive early access to podcast episodes without ads, bonus episodes, free and discounted merchandise and other content. For example, our Patreon supporters can listen to an exclusive bonus episode now where our guest Andy Littlechild discusses his anarcho-syndicalist politics and tells us about one of the times management tried to sack him for workplace organising. Join us or find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. People who have listened to our show for a long time may remember that our episode 5 was about rank-and-file workers organising on the London Underground. But like all our early episodes, it was basically raw audio from our interview, so the sound quality was pretty bad, and there was no narrative to fill in any gaps, explain context, or pull the story together. In addition to producing new podcast episodes, we're also going back over our earliest episodes to re-edit and re-release them in the new narrative format that we use for all our later episodes. So this is one of our improved and re-released episodes, which has additional narrative with better quality audio to explain things more clearly and tell the story in a more cohesive way. So whether you listened to that early episode or not, we hope that you enjoy this one. For this episode, we spoke to Andy Littlechild, a former track charge hand who at the time we interviewed him was a National Executive Committee member for the London Transport region of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union, also known as the RMT. We say former because since we first released the episode, Andy has retired from his job on the London Underground. So we wanted to redo this episode not just to get his experiences out there for others to learn from, but also because he's such a massively respected workplace activist, and we wanted the opportunity to wish him well. So much love to you, Andy, and all the best. We hope you enjoy your well-earned retirement. When we met up with Andy, it was to talk about London Underground workers' resistance to a privatisation scheme in the late 90s and early 2000s called the Public-Private Partnership, otherwise known as PPP. However, as Andy explained, London Underground had had plans to increase their use of outsourcing and privatisation since the early 90s.
The background goes way back to a big corporate shake-up on London Underground called a company plan. And amongst other things, what they did there was they brought in agencies and casualised labour to work on a track. First company is called Finch Palm. And the union didn't react to it. They took a view that it wasn't a threat, but within a year or two, more and more work was being done by Finch Palm. And, typically they didn't join the union. They were pretty badly exploited in the way they were treated. There was some strike action and we held out a bit, but fundamentally company plan came in probably with some modifications and some compromises, but it was seen as a defeat by the members, and the members felt let down by the RMT at the time. Various other bits and pieces that they took, they got rid of pay bill, so we lost a lot of members because the company cancelled collecting the subs from the RMT. They kept it on for the other unions, but not for us. And it took us a long time to get those members back. And the legacy of company plan hung over into the PPP, which started in the very late 90s into the early 2000s. In reality, the union should have stopped that from happening in the first instance because, one, it wouldn't have undermined the union, but more importantly, actually, all of those workers would have been employed by London Underground because the work needed to be done with decent contracts, terms and conditions and union rights. So, but that's how it happened. They got in the door of a company called Finch Palm, and then they proliferated everywhere, but there was several changes as they were made to compete for contracts and the cheapest bid wins and all of that. So around about this time we ended up with another outfit, and probably at Lilliebridge Depot there was 170 odd full-time staff, and it fluctuates between sort of 200 and 300 up to 800 at times, self-employed and agency workers, and that's what the situation was in at the time that Workmates was set up. Just one thing to note, and that is, in recent years, London Underground approached the RMT and said, would you like us now to reinstate pay bill? So we told them that we're fine as we are, we take care of our own affairs now, okay. So we don't use pay bill.
The changes being brought in by management obviously gave no thought to the conditions faced by workers. For instance, the kind of work carried out by track maintenance workers like Andy was, and still is, extremely physically demanding, as he explained during our interview.
So on London Underground, the track has to be patrolled, and then running repairs have to be done on a nightly basis. So we start work when the trains have stopped running, and they've cleared all the passengers out, and then they turn the traction current off on the track. And then we go down to work after all the safety checks have been performed to make sure the track's dead and all of that. And then we work. We typically get on the track about 1 o'clock in the morning, and you're normally there till 4, 4:30, sometimes later, depending on where you're working, how far away from train depots you are, because that affects how much time you get on the track. And during that time, there's very short breaks, just have a drink of water really. It's hammer and tongs, you've got to go at it. So it's 3.5, 4 hours work, but at a real heavy, fast pace. And it's in the tunnels, it's hot, dusty. The tools we use are very loud, air-powered concrete breakers. You've got stuff jacked up everywhere, people digging, people breaking out sleepers, people shoveling up the ballast to remove it in the broken up concrete. And it's like being in a battle. That's what it's like. It's hot, and you come out, covered in dust and filth and sweat and grease.
The plans for PPP were announced in the latter half of the decade, supposedly as an alternative to privatisation. But in reality, privatisation was exactly what it was, just in parts rather than wholesale.
It was New Labour that actually privatised the infrastructure on the underground. So they left the stations and the trains and everything supporting those in the public sector, and they privatised track, signals, train maintenance, and all of the engineering functions and the supports, the office-based kind of like supports, was all privatised into two companies, one called Metronet, which ended up with 2/3 of the infrastructure, and a smaller company called Tube Lines Consortium that ended up with 1/3. Through all the things that the company do, they're obviously trying to cut costs is a big driver, and attacking workers' rights and the function of a union is a big aspect to that, and ongoing cuts. So by employing agency staff and staff who are self-employed under this bogus self-employment kind of thing, you get a situation where you've got a non-unionised workforce who not only do they not have anyone to negotiate on their behalf for pay and all those sorts of things, but they're sackable at a moment's notice.
Unlike permanent employees, agency workers have far fewer legal rights. The same goes for workers labelled as self-employed contractors, even though in many cases, in a legal sense, they should technically be recognised as employees. Fake self-employment is a common tactic of employers to get around employment law in the UK and in many other countries.
It enables you as a company to get around having to have some loyalty towards people who you're putting out to work of a day and a night, and also by employing them that way, they're very much less likely to join the union, which means you diminish the strength of the union as well, which, if you can remove the union from the equation, means that you can have free rein to bring in whatever changes and cuts that you want to bring in. In terms of privatising the infrastructure on London Underground, which they did do, it was, I don't know if I'm being cynical here, but a big part of it was kicking back money to their buddies and friends in big business. Again, it was hoped that it would save money through taking on the union and taking on the staff and bringing in efficiencies and downsizing and all these different terms they had for it, and to save money that way. But it was also part of a political and a philosophical ethos of getting rid of, state-run, national-run industries and opening everything up to the private sector. Each one of these consortiums, Metronet and Tube Lines, was comprised of different construction type firms: W.S. Atkins, Thames Water, Bombardier, Balfour Beatty. And what it was a massive rinsing operation where they would, instead of procuring materials and equipment and tools and whatever in the way they would do it, they put it through these companies, which are the parent companies that made the consortium up. So there's all that sort of rinsing going on, but much higher cost. But then the main thing was, the whole time really was about trying to rip off the government and the taxpayer and the travelling public and the workforce where they could. And it was just like a continual reorganisation and rewirings and different things they tried to do it, trying to cut out jobs. That's what it was really. And that was the main focus of these private companies, these consortiums. It seemed to be they were more interested in doing that than they were with running a railway. That was secondary, running a railway, to what they were there primarily to do, and that is to just get their hands in the till. That's how it seemed to us, and I think that's pretty much what it was. And obviously it couldn't cope with that, so eventually they ran out of money and they went broke.
Privatisation has often been promoted by its supporters as a way of not just reducing state spending, but also improving services and reducing ticket prices. However, anyone who's taken a train in the UK recently could tell you that that's not the case. Rail fares in the UK are the highest in Europe and have gone up by at least 20% in real terms since the railways were privatised. The main privatised railway infrastructure firm, Railtrack, went into administration in 2001, just 7 years after it was founded, and had to effectively be renationalised as Network Rail. And in the last 5 years, 5 rail lines have been renationalised because of things like unreliable services, the collapse of parent companies, and attempted tax fraud. And one of those lines, the Transpennine Express, was actually so unreliable that it was cancelling almost a quarter of its trains in the months leading up to being renationalised in May 2023. And alongside failing to improve services, privatisation also comes with attempts by bosses to tear up workers' terms and conditions. But despite all these problems, there was initially a bit of reluctance from some workers to resist it.
And people brought up the company plan fiasco then. We're really going to fight this public-private partnership when we did so badly in the company plan. And they still bring up today occasionally.
There was also the issue Andy mentioned over the division created by management between permanently employed staff, who are mostly in the union, and those employed via an agency or with self-employed status, who weren't union members. But as Andy explains here, he made use of guidelines put out by ACAS, which is the government advisory service that mediates industrial disputes. Specifically, he took the guidelines that allow union reps paid time off to do union duties during work time, otherwise known as facility time, and used it for the benefit of all workers at his depot, regardless of union affiliation.
Because what we used to do at Lily Bridge was, when we had meetings with management, we used to enact the ACAS guidelines that say that you should have the facility time to report back to your members following meetings. So what we'd typically do, we'd use that, and we'd have a meeting sort of like within a week or two of the meeting with management when we had the minutes printed up, and we'd often distribute them around so people could follow through the minutes. And we used to have everyone in the canteen, whether they're union members or not, and whether they work for London Underground or whether they're agency or contractors.
Some of Andy's fellow union members weren't always keen on having non-union workers participate in meetings, and many union members are often sceptical in general of agency workers, who are seen by some as undercutting permanent workers' conditions.
Some of the London Underground members weren't keen on this, but I just explained to them, these are our workmates, the war is against people in suits, overalls versus suits, not overalls versus overalls, to simplify it. And I wouldn't put them out. And then what happened was Bob Crow come down to the depot during the PPP dispute when we was fighting it, and he came down to talk to us, and some of the members approached him and said, Bob, there's people in here, contractors in here, we don't want them in here. And to give him his due, Bob told him the same thing, so they stayed in.
Bob Crow was the leader of the RMT at the time. And as Andy explained, with Bob Crow's support, the agency staff and contractors continued to attend workplace meetings. And Andy's strategy was soon proven to be the right one, as London Underground workers began to fight back against plans to contract out work via PPP.
And then the proof of the pudding was seen when we got into strike action against the PPP. This is in the very early days. This was around 1998 to 1999, sometime around then. Yeah. And what happened was we had a number of our own staff and members come into work during strike, but not one of the agency guys came in across the picket line. And some of them in Kent and Wales and in Doncaster had previously been miners, right? And they basically went around their work colleagues saying, "You're not crossing the picket line."
Just to underline how significant this was, it's important to point out that not only were these workers not in the union officially engaged in the dispute, but as agency workers and contractors, they wouldn't have had any legal protection at all in case of dismissal.
Well, yeah, I didn't sort of shrink back from pointing out to people, and it completely changed the whole feeling of it all. So all of that stuff about we don't want them in our meetings, no one could. I think generally it did shift people as well,
So the mass meetings continued, with RMT reps using their official credentials to benefit all workers and acting accountable to the decisions made in those meetings. And out of those early struggles against PPP, the Workmates Delegate Council began to emerge.
This is why it came about, because we then embarked on a series of strikes against the privatisation. And of course, as I point out to everyone, including the agency guys, it is in no one's interest what the company's planning, and it would actually be worse for the agency guys too. But we worked sort of cheek by jowl with each other down the track, so we knew each other, and so that just solidarity was there as well. And then what happened was fighting PPP, the public-private partnership. I think also at some point we had disputes over pay, our own LU disputes, that is. And so then, the obvious question is we're getting all this solidarity back, all this solidarity from these agency and self-employed workers, our mates, but the union's not really in a position to do anything for them. So Workmates was set up, one, to bond the solidarity and to give a bit of structure, but then also to explore ways that the solidarity could be returned to the agency guys. Right, first of all, the term Workmates is because that's what we were. Right, so that's why that was the term that was used, because it's the most straightforward. So that's how the name came about, how we first started organising in that fashion so that the workforce would be giving us what they want us to do. And then when we started to get more organised, that's when we set up the council. And the idea of the council was that however you construed yourself to be a gang, because track work is done in gangs, because each bit of work you do is a project, because we do the heavy maintenance and renewals, not the running repairs and inspections. We're the heavy maintenance and renewals section. So it's all ongoing work, and a gang based typically runs that site until the completion. It could be 6 months, it could be a year and a half. Now, people constitute what they see as a gang in different ways. It could be the people you work with all the time, or it could be, if you're travelling in a van from wherever, the guys you travel in with. So we kind of let people determine what their gang was, how they consider their gang to be, and then elect to nominate someone to sit on the council. So then the council was made up, and at one point we had 16 delegates. We made sure that the contractors really made use of this. So because in a sense, we had some LU staff as well, but it's easier because of the RMT to represent them. So, but it's more important that the contractors and the agency staff had delegates, so their voice was more present.
Workmates was a great example of rank and file democratic practice. As Andy said, the Workmates Council was made up of 16 delegates, each representing a different gang. Gang size varied from around 10-ish to 20-odd, which meant hundreds of workers, the majority of them contractors and agency staff, were represented on the council where otherwise they would have had no means of organisation at all. Leaflets were given out to different gangs encouraging them to join the delegate council. The leaflets also included instructions on how to elect a delegate and what a delegate does, explaining that, quote, gang delegates do not speak for themselves but on the mandate given to them by their gang. Delegates report back to the gang and are instantly recallable, end quote. If you'd like to see some of the Workmates leaflets, we've got images of some of them on the webpage for this episode, link in the show notes. As a final flourish, Andy also had little badges made up with Workmates written across a red and black background, a reference to the flag of anarcho-syndicalism, which is a form of anarchist politics applied to the labour movement. Anarcho-syndicalism was the main political current motivating workers during the Spanish Civil War in 1936-39, which we talk about in our episodes 39-40. We go into more detail about what anarcho-syndicalism is and its influence on Andy's politics and activism in our bonus episode, available exclusively for our supporters on Patreon. Despite Workmates operating outside of their control, the RMT was still glad to see rail workers getting organised who were usually outside their remit.
It was supportive because what it did was a grade of workers, i.e. track workers, who were always seen as not being fantastic at taking strike action. There was this example over in West London where it was like rock solid, and that was used, not by me but by other people in meetings. When we were organising strike action, it was often referenced. Even down at Lily Bridge, they've even got the contractors coming out. So there's no reason why you shouldn't get your members out who work on stations or trains or wherever. And people, I remember, used to say, we heard that you've organised a Soviet at Lily Bridge. The Lily Bridge is run as a Soviet. Yeah. So it did get around, and it's been mentioned in things that have been written about the PPP dispute. It's been referenced and stuff as well. What we did at Lily Bridge. So. And it also gave us a reputation for management, which was actually quite good. We were known as the Lions' Den, so it was one of them said to us,
This joke about Lily Bridge being run as a Soviet refers to the Russian Revolution and the workers' councils that were set up by workers to collectively take over the running of society, which were known as Soviets, and were the subject to the revolutionary slogan, "All power to the Soviets." As for Workmates, the Delegate Council was up and running for about 18 months, from 1999 to 2001. While the mass meetings were held regularly, the Delegate Council mostly met on special occasions, such as if management attempted to introduce new working practices. So as well as the ongoing struggles against privatisation, Workmates was involved in a number of other disputes, the biggest probably being against management's attempt to end a practice called job and knock.
Job and knock is something that is widespread in the industry. And what it means is you get your work that you've been allocated for the day done, and then you go home. Right. So, and it's something that is unofficial. It's not something that's sanctioned officially by management, but it's often in their favour because they know the work's getting done, and then they're keeping the staff happy by not really kind of seeing that they've gone home early. And that's the way it's always been on London Underground, pretty much everywhere. So that's what job on knock is. And what happened was the departmental manager, the top manager in what we're called track force, he was studying at university to get his business dissertation, and he was looking at a fad management kind of way of working, where you, in their words, you don't work harder, you just work smarter, which is what they try and fool you with. But really, it's just to get more work out of you. So he brought in some consultants who they were given a different name. They weren't called consultants, but they were. And they came down and they basically watched how we did our work, and they talked to members of the gang and tried to smooth out all of the downtime and keep more people working all the time to get more work done. But while he's doing that to try and speed the work up, he was also doing privately, personally, his own business dissertation to get a qualification of whatever sort, some sort of degree or something. And he used his own workplace and what he was trying to do at the department to speed the work up as the case study. Like, so basically that's what he was using. So, but what it also involved was the removal of job and knock, because this approach required intensive briefings before you got to work. So you had these rooms built called briefing rooms. None of this stuff really got used very long, by the way. It was like a flash in the pan because he was doing his thing. So he built these briefing rooms where you brief before you go out to work, which is all well and good, and then speed the work up while you're at work by taking on board the recommendations from consultancy of how you streamline the work to keep people working all the time, less kind of like sort of down points where only one person could do something. And at the end you come back to the depot and you have a debrief and you talk about the next night's work, and you plan it in detail, which is something we'd never ever done, and there was really no need to do it. But it was all part of his kind of like a Brave New World. So that removed job and knock, because we'd have to come back, all of the gang, and sit there till 6:30 in the morning, talking about the job, right, which none of us were overly interested in. Because the work that we did was, you didn't really want to come back and sit in the depot after being down the tunnel. So what happened was there was a load of things that we used to do that were common practice, but weren't necessarily by the rules. And we were always being picked up on these things by management, especially if something went wrong and then they asked you, well, how did this happen? You told them. And likewise, anything that was in the rules that we weren't doing, they loved us doing it as long as nothing went wrong, because it sped the job up. But if something went wrong, then you'd find yourself being disciplined for not doing it. So all this was going on and people getting in trouble when something mishap occurred. So I decided to tackle it around the same time they were ending job and knock. So I made a long list of all the various things that we all knew were going on the track that you could potentially get in trouble for, and said, these things, we need to work to the actual procedures and policies, and would staff and people like me to print these up as an aid memoir of the things to do and not to do. And that was agreed that should be done. So the plan was I was going to distribute that the following night, and also we were going to pull the Workmates Council together the following night to make sure that it was supported in the gangs. So that was the plan. However, what happened was there was a whole rake of things, like not having a first aider on site was against the rules. Obviously, if you need to use a toilet, you're not supposed to actually piss in the track. You're supposed to go back to use the toilet on the station, and so on and so forth. All those things were discussed, and we're going to be handed out the following night, and the Delegates Council was going to kind of like support that. But what happened was the staff and all the workforce decided to take matters into their own hands and started that night, which was not, the plan. It started off its own back, and the interesting thing was I was in charge of a work site that night, and my mate, who happened to be one of the only other anarchists working on the track, who was in my gang, he pointed out that we didn't have a first aider on site. So I'm in charge of the job, right? So I went through the procedures, and I phoned up the office and told them, and the supervisor said, well, can you be covered by the station supervisor? Because sometimes there's a provision for that. And I said, no, because we're too far down the tunnel, which is something that means that can't happen. The station supervisor can't cover if you're too far down the tunnel, because they've also got to cover the station, so they can't be everywhere. So then the supervisor said, well, can you see if the gang working a few stops up have got a second first aider, and you can get him over, tell him that I said that you can buy him. So we had to go off the track and then try and get hold of them, and it just went on all night and we ended up not doing any work. So then it kicked off like this all over the place in various different kind of guises. On the first night it just broke out everywhere and it carried on for a couple of days.
Andy and his workmates basically caused havoc by just following the rules. They also made use of this tactic, better known as a work to rule, in other creative ways as well.
Another thing that's quite common was, if you're on a track for like 4 hours, at some point the likelihood is you're going to need to go to the toilet, and whereas it's common practice when you're miles down the track, you don't go back to the toilet, you just go in the ballast. Staff weren't willing to do that because actually you are supposed to go back and use the toilet. But the difficulty there is you can only go on a track and be unaccompanied if you are trained as what's called a protection master, which means you understand all of the safety limits, where you're working and where the live current sections may be and all of that. So anyone who goes back, unless they're a protection master, they need to be accompanied by a protection master. But then the problem is if there's only one protection master, then that leaves the gang without a protection master while, say, Fred goes to the toilet. And so that's what happened. Like a member of the gang would say, I want to go and use the toilet, and then the charge would say, well, okay, crack on. And they say, well, I need a protection master to go back with me. And then you go, okay, then, like, Frank, can you go back with Paul? So they'd be getting ready to walk up the track, and then the gang would say, hang on a minute, you can't leave us on the track without Frank, he's a protection master. So the charge hand would say, oh, fuck it, okay, everyone's back to the platform. And then the whole gang would have to up sticks and move back to the platform, and then, well, someone went to the toilet, and then they went back down the tunnel again to resume work, and then half an hour later someone else wanted to go to the toilet, and you had to repeat the process over again. So that went on a couple of sites, and what happened was after 2 days productivity dropped, and it was dropping down below 80% of what we'd normally typically do. And the manager called me and one of the other reps in the office and said, we all know what's going on here, and our productivity is nosediving. He blamed another manager for having the idea of bringing us back in the morning and do these debriefings. He said it wasn't actually my idea, it was this other manager's, and he said that he would assure us that it was going to stop. So in other words, without saying it, job and knock could be reinstated, which I reported back to the canteen, and everyone was very happy. And I think that was on the third shift, people started just getting back to how things were before.
Swift direct action from the rank and file meant that management's plan to end job and knock had been defeated, but whether the events made it into their manager's business studies dissertation remains shrouded in mystery.
Yeah, he may have chosen to admit that part of it, because I don't think it would have done him much favour with his examiners. Yeah.
The Workmates collective showed that when organised, agency workers and contractors were willing to show solidarity with their directly employed counterparts on the London Underground. As a result, directly employed staff started to return the favour.
With all this going on and all the support that we've been having, the dispute over job and knock affected everyone, so everyone had a stake in it. But a lot of the disputes that we were getting support from the contractors and the agency workers. There weren't even their disputes. It is over, you could say the PPP would affect them too, the privatisation of the tube, but they actually came out and showed us solidarity in our pay disputes and stuff as well. So when their company came to them to make some quite drastic changes to their rate of pay, I think it was, that their money was going to be dropped down, I put it to a meeting that this was completely out of order, and how do people feel about supporting the contractors? And so the views from across the piece was that there would be an overtime ban.
However, Andy and his fellow workers made one error, which ultimately decided the fate of this particular dispute.
What happened was we made one blunder, and that is we did not have something in place for if the contract and agency staff were threatened by their management. So what happened on the first night, back after we'd made this decision, it got back to management that no one was going to be working overtime. And what the contract firm chose to do was send in their most senior supervisor who dealt with the guys the next night, and he stood by the booking on desk in their booking on point in the depot with a very simple question, and that is, are you coming to work on a weekend or aren't you? And because we hadn't prepared them, in hindsight, we should have said, anyone who's threatened and we're down tools, or anyone who's threatened would do this, or whatever it is we decided. But we didn't have that in place, so we didn't see this coming. They were booking on, and anyone who said that they weren't working overtime were just told, well, you can go home now, you're sacked. Right, so with that, we experienced a massive defeat there, really, and the contractors en masse basically signed up to do the overtime because they had no choice in the matter, because we hadn't kind of put any protection around them because we didn't see it coming. But some of the LU staff, obviously a much more safer and privileged position, still refused to do the overtime as a protest.
It was after this dispute that the Workmates Council started to wind down.
It didn't come to an end in a kind of like it just stopped. The Delegates Council sort of withered away, I think partly because of the kind of defeat we had over the changes to the contracts terms and conditions with the overtime ban that kind of went wrong. But it wasn't just that, there was also high turnover amongst the contractors, either them being laid off or being moved, or so on and so forth. So because of the high turnover, it was not easy to keep it going forever. So the council kind of like came to an end of it, just sort of fizzled out. But we still kept Workmates in a larger sense going, and it's still going to this day in some respects, because that's still, when we advertise our meetings in the depot, there's still Workmates meetings. So in that respect, it's still sort of going, but it's just not. It had a heyday when it was really functioning really well, and it's not there anymore. But we still have the same principles, and meetings are open to everyone. The reps report back on stuff relating to contractors and to staff. Everyone there is encouraged to speak their mind and ask questions, and also we seek a view from everyone on what they want us to do. So in that respect, it's still going. I mean, when it was more highly organised, there was cards, Workmates cards and badges and stuff like that. I mean, we don't really use those anymore, so it's much more kind of low-key. Mm-hmm. But the workforce, considering everyone to be workmates, is still there. The feeling is still there.
This feeling of solidarity and willingness to respect each other's disputes, whatever your terms of employment, was something that stuck with a lot of the people who got involved in Workmates, even after Workmates eventually wound down.
Well, in a real concrete way, there were some of the agency staff and self-employed guys who used to work at Lily Bridge and went through this, who were then transferred to work on the lines. They ended up on the Victoria line on the North End, and we got into a pay dispute, a London Underground pay dispute, and the whole gang of LU staff come in and broke their own strike. But the contractors who used to work at Lily Bridge Depot, it wasn't even their dispute. They didn't stand anything to gain out of it. They didn't come into work when LU counterparts whose dispute it was come in. And I think Workmates has made the contractors feel that they can fight, and there was lots of battles we had, just daily battles with management over health and safety, where people were being asked to do things that were unsafe, that the contractors developed the confidence to refuse to do it, because they've still got the right to refuse to work on the grounds of health and safety. We'd always support them, but they would be willing to actually, whereas before they weren't. They were had to be coaxed into it. They were much more pugnacious than they would ever go. So, and I think that the way that Lily Bridge was so solid during the PPP dispute, which involved the Workmates way of organising there, did affect the actual PPP dispute, especially on track, and it also kind of stiffened up other grades on the underground because it was all grades dispute. And I think it did play a role in firming up the whole of the RMT, actually, in the way that we fought the PPP. It did play a role. I wouldn't try and over-egg it and say that it was bigger than it was, but it was definitely there. Because it's like a knock-on effect. If you can firm up a depot, then you can firm up, the track depot, then you firm up the track grades, and then the other grades are drivers and station staff and signals and fleet maintainers see that the track grades are fighting, so then they're encouraged. So it had a kind of a virtuous circle going upwards that helped out.
And with that broader willingness to fight across the London Underground, it's no surprise that the struggle against privatisation on the Tube continued after Workmates.
Well, it continued on, and what happened was we wrung a whole load of concessions out of the company, out of London Underground, who were our employees until we got TUPE'd over to Metronet and Tube Lines.
TUPE here stands for Transfer of Undertakings Protection of Employment, which basically is a set of laws that are supposed to protect your rights if your employment is transferred from one employer to another. So for instance, if you work for a service that's being privatised and your employer changes from the local government to a private company, TUPE is supposed to mean that you keep the same terms and conditions as before. But unfortunately, it's a very weak set of laws.
The main thing was called the Jobs for Life deal, which meant it is a bolt-on to TUPE. So this Jobs for Life deal was like an addition to TUPE that strengthened it, but also strengthened all of our agreements and stuff like that, and also protected our pensions and so on and so forth. The whole lot, it really did. And it had stuff in there. We managed to force things in there like job numbers, normally only a matter for consultation on health and safety. Well, we got it in there in agreement, agreed that they were a matter for negotiation. And so it was a fantastic document that we took over into privatisation with us. But it's not just that. We took over into privatisation, we won a lot of concessions and defend ourselves with, but we also went in there with a fighting spirit, so and that carried us through till we got renationalised. And the funny thing is when we came back into LU, we'd managed to hold on to a lot of stuff that the uniform side, while we was privatised, lost it. So we came back with superior terms and conditions to our LU counterparts that stayed in the public sector, like paternity leave. We got better paternity leave and rights to be represented at a fact finding. On LU they haven't got that, but in Metronet we managed to win that and hang on to it, and we still got it because it got TUPE back into LU from Metronet, so it's been carried over by TUPE. So yeah, and bits and pieces like that. So that's what happened with the PPP dispute until Metronet, and then very recently also Tube Lines went belly up and we all got renationalised.
In the end, PPP turned out to be an absolute policy disaster. While the consortiums involved received contracts worth billions of pounds and were supposed to last 30 years, Tube Lines only lasted 7 years and Metronet went bust after just 4. Not only were they unable to complete their contracts, but the bill for their failures were all picked up by the public. Losses from Metronet's poor financial control were put at somewhere between 170 and 410 million pounds. In 2010, the local government body Transport for London bought out company shares in Tube Lines, paying £310 million, and then the following year acquired almost all of Tube Lines' debt to the tune of £1.3 billion. All of this was on top of the £2 billion paid by the government to cover its guarantee to Metronet's creditors and cover its administration costs. But beyond just exposing the failures of tube privatisation, the experience of resistance to the scheme also contains many lessons for workers everywhere, like the way Andy and his colleagues ignored the anti-strike laws and took swift direct action to win disputes quickly.
And that's very true. It's you can do it pretty much straight away. You can do it once you've got agreement amongst your workmates, wherever you work. If you've got that ability to have that discussion and reach that agreement, you can then do it pretty much as soon as you want to. Obviously there's lots of things you've got to do to protect yourself You don't want management to be able to pick people out and stuff like that. So you need to be mindful of that. But if you've catered for all the things that could go wrong and thought it through, you can apply your work to rule or your strike pretty much immediately without having to go through all of those measures. That fundamentally those measures are there to put you off or make it difficult for you to take action to defend yourself and to take the steam out of the feeling out by the time you actually eventually have gone through those hoops and hurdles. You know, sometimes the steam has gone out of the feeling's gone, and people have started to accommodate themselves to what management are doing, and it becomes normalised. So it prevents that from happening if you can take action immediately rather than I think the lead time now for taking action is probably about 5 weeks if you go through all the legal niceties.
And more broadly, the Workmates experience showed the value of bringing workers in a workplace together, regardless of what kind of contracts they're on.
Yeah, I think it's relevant in terms of it. You know, you feel stronger if you, with other people, are thinking about issues that happen to you at work or that management are doing, and then you start making decisions to resist them. It did do some over long-term sort of like benefits to the contractors who work on the underground. And in terms of other people who are working in sort of like industries where they've not got a union, I'd say that it's the most obvious and logical place to start, because they will control their own disputes. They all know what the issues are they're facing, you know, whether they're working in the gig economy or in catering or wherever they might be. Obviously you have to do it carefully because you want to sort of like filter out any kind of stooges of management or spies or anything like that. But it's actually something that's very natural, and it's not, you don't have to have a deep kind of philosophical grounding in trade unionism or politics, even though that's helpful to do it. It's just about basic human solidarity between you and your workmates, and knowing that you've got more in common with each other than you have with your boss, and just looking at the issues you've got in the workplace. And if you've got a mechanism where you can do that and discuss things and make joint decisions, then you've also, if you've got the will to fight as well, then you're in with a chance of defending yourselves and maybe even pushing your interests forward.
Portami via, oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. Partigiano, portami via, che mi sento di morir, e se muoio.
That's all we've got time for today. As always, we've got more information, sources and links in the webpage for this episode. Link in the show notes. If you'd like to hear more from Andy, check out our bonus episode where he talks about the influence of anarcho-syndicalism on his politics and workplace activism. He also tells us a great story about how he and his colleagues resisted management attempts to sack him for union organising. It's only support from you, our listeners, which allows us to make these podcasts. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us on patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. In return for your support, you get early access to content, as well as ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted merch and more. And if you can't spare the cash, that's absolutely no problem. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. We'd like to thank all of our amazing Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jameson D. Saltzman, Jazz Hands and Fernando Lopez Ojeda. Our theme tune is Bella Ciao. Thanks for permission to use it from Dischi del Sole. You can buy it or stream it on the links in the show notes. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Anyway, that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the episode and thanks for listening.
Morto per la libertà.